I'm excited. I'm going to sit down with RJ Scaringe from Rivian here in just a few minutes to have a fireside chat. I don't see a fire, but we are going to have a fireside, maybe light a candle. But before that, we wanted to show you guys a film that Rivian recently released. And so with that, Don, roll it, buddy.
We as a society right now happen to be alive at this massive inflection point for our planet, perhaps one of the most significant moments in recorded human history. We've witnessed our species develop technology and industrialized capabilities that were unimaginable just a few hundred years ago. But we're also able to witness and be part of arguably one of the most important transitions as we move to a world that runs without the need for fossil fuels. I grew up a massive car enthusiast and loved everything about cars, the way they felt, the idea of driving them, the freedom they afforded. As I got older, I realized that these things I loved so much that were so critical for our progress as society were simultaneously the root of the impact they're having on our climate and the role that they're playing in the recarbonization of our atmosphere. Our atmosphere looks the way it does today as a result of many, many, many millions of years of carbon being captured, sequestered from the atmosphere into largely plants and to a much lesser degree animals, and buried in the crust of the earth and ultimately converting into fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum. And our society in just a few generations has taken what accumulated over hundreds of millions of years and reinserted that CO2 back into the atmosphere by burning these fossil fuels in just over 150 years. And the difference in timescales is staggering. We're at the very beginning of seeing the impacts of that. We're seeing it in the form of much higher temperatures on the surface of the Earth. We're seeing it in the form of much more aggressive storms and weather patterns. This is still early days, but it's going to make the planet less inhabitable, not just us as a human species, but we're seeing it accelerate the rate of extinction on our planet to a level that's never before been seen. This is the moment where we have a choice. When one imagines what the history books will look like 2,000 years from now, they're going to look back and there's going to be this little blip, which is likely called the fossil fuel era. And it'll talk about a couple of hundred years of human history where we as a planet rapidly industrialized, built amazing technologies, but also developed this deep dependency on fossil fuels. And then hopefully the history books read that we developed new technologies to move off of fossil fuels before we put all of that carbon back into the atmosphere. The scale of this challenge means that we need to begin making these changes now, and we need to begin working towards ever-increasing renewable content on our grid. We need to replace the roughly 1.5 billion combustion-powered vehicles on our planet with electric vehicles, but also know that on the path to the end state, we're going to have solutions that are imperfect. But we need to start. And the exciting thing with electric vehicles is they get cleaner over time. As we remove carbon from our grid and replace it with fossil fuel-free energy, the vehicle becomes cleaner and more efficient over its life. We need to protect our only home to ensure that the gift of such a diverse and such a beautiful planet that's so unique is maintained. It's a world that we can continue to explore and to continue to enjoy for generations to come, for our kids and for their kids' kids' kids, for forever.
That was awesome. I love that. At this moment in time, we have a choice.
Yep.
Good to see you, RJ. Thank you for sitting down with us. Well, that was an incredibly inspiring film. Really remarkable to see your vision become a reality. I think the first question that comes to mind for me is, Starting a car company is a pretty audacious thing to do. Can you talk a little bit about your passions for the outdoors? We talked earlier about both being surfers, how that and your passion for automobiles integrated into the vision of Rivian, and then that vision becoming a reality.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up a car enthusiast. I loved anything with four wheels and was enamored by it. And as I got older, I realized that these things I loved so much were causing so many challenges. And there was a moment where I was like, man, I feel this deep conflict. I love cars, but is it wrong to love these things that are causing so many of our problems across the world? And so around the time I was maybe, I don't know, in high school, 14, 15 years old, I decided I want to start a car company, which was my way of thinking about how can I help be part of the solution. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what goes into building a car company. I didn't even know what, where to start. But then that sort of became the journey I knew I wanted to be on. So I started really working towards that. And, as you said, starting a car company is not a simple thing. You need tons of capital. You need a really large team. You need lots of infrastructure, lots of suppliers, lots of partners. But it was really built around the mission and the central question that informed everything that ultimately led to the creation of Rivian, and still informs the decisions we take today is how can we maximize our impact and maximize the positive impact we can have in what is certainly once in a generation, but I'd say once in like a millennium kind of transition of moving the entire planet off of our dependency on fossil fuels towards a world that's going to be sustainable and renewable for many, many generations to come. And I think it's a gift that we have to be alive in this moment. I said it in the video we just showed. There's like few times where you can sit here and think, boy, we're like in a history book. This is such a critical moment. And so many businesses have to be created. Many businesses have to develop technologies, products, drive new consumer behavior. So I wanted to be part of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's the same thing that I've considered too. Like we're living at an inflection point in history where the crisis is actually the thing that is driving innovation. Yeah. The obviousness of the crisis is the thing that is getting human beings to wake up and beginning to invest in a different direction. I like to say we're investing in the direction of healthy life. Yeah. And ultimately your organization really exemplifies that. When you were in the early stages of creating Rivian, were there specific core values that you said this car company to be successful and to be what I want it to represent in the world, these are the core values that we have to focus on. Like these are the things that we cannot compromise.
I mean, there's a lot of values we designed in. One of the things we talked, probably the word we said the most was how do we make sure that the products we build and the brand that we create is incredibly inviting. And in fact, the idea of putting that little film that we just showed together, actually Nick sitting here in third row in and I dreamed it up, was we wanted to make sure that when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about building a future for our kids, this isn't a political topic. And super unfortunately, we've seen things like sustainability, things like addressing climate change become politicized in the U.S. and it shouldn't and doesn't need to be that way. And so as a brand, we've said since the very beginning, we want to create a brand that helps invite people in, feels welcoming, and that manifests in lots of different ways. It manifests in the way the products look. It manifests down into even the details of like in the foyer here, you see it's a polished concrete floor. And we wanted it to look like the kind of place you could walk into and be invited into with sandy feet and your shoes off. And that doesn't mean it's not a great space, it's not a nice experience, but every decision we take wants to invite people into this transition. And I think often when you have big changes, particularly ones that involve shifts in social behavior or culture, they can be things that drive people apart. And so we saw this as an opportunity to try to pull people together.
Amazing. I feel confident that this is true for car making, especially EV car making. It's certainly true in the world that I live in packaging. Sustainability is not a straight line.
Yeah.
And there's often trade-offs, that you have to evaluate. I tell people a lot, like, if you wanted to create the lowest carbon packaging, single-use plastic would be it. I mean, it has a very low carbon footprint, but the opportunities for pollution are super high.
Yeah.
So we have to balance those things, and you have to decide in certain applications what is the right stakeholder to acknowledge, and it becomes a nuanced thing, and it requires an analytical approach. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you, as the leader and founder of Rivian, think about sustainability and those trade-offs? I mean, obviously, as an EV company, carbon mitigation is fundamental, but you also have a significant supply chain, I'm assuming that's global, where you've got everything from rare earth minerals and batteries and the type of materials you use in the car for the seats and the dashboards and all the parts. And how do you guys consider the different stakeholders or different agendas around sustainability and balance those things?
Wes, I love this question. I think it's such an important one. And, when we think about the transition to a truly sustainable economy, something that can exist for thousands of years to come, I think we get really hung up as a society on understanding, sort of being able to squint and say, okay, I can imagine this infinite future state, but the intermediate steps to get there are not perfectly clean. There's no big green button we can press that says, like, instantly go to 100% renewable grid, instantly have completely well built out supply chains. And so we need to be careful to recognize that we're not going to be able to make an instantaneous step to perfection. And I'll take automotive as an example of this, but you referenced packaging. You see this in almost every walk of life. The nature of how our societies evolved to live, we can have conditioned air, we can have lights inside a room, we can eat strawberries but live in a cold climate. We can do all these things that are actually, they seem so normal to us, but they're really recent things. Like 200 years ago, if you lived in Maine, you're not going to have bananas in December. And that's just a recent development because we can put things in airplanes and we can transport things around the planet really quickly. But we become accustomed to that. So if we were to say we want to reduce our carbon emissions as a planet dramatically, we'd have to really change lifestyle. And before I started Rivian, I really struggled with this myself because as a car enthusiast, I said, no matter what we do, there's going to be a carbon footprint for the vehicle. And so I went through this cycle of, should I be starting a car company or should I be starting like a walking promotion company and just get everybody to walk? And so I went on this experiment one summer while I was in college, and I said, I'm going to try to minimize my own carbon emissions and go to the most extreme levels. And so no dishwashers, no water heater, no clothes washers, clotheslines in my room, really hardcore. And I got done with it, and I'm like, boy, that was horrible. No one is gonna sign up for that. And the reality is
we have hours in the day.
The future state we need to create needs to be something that people are excited about and choose to do, and doesn't require daily hard decisions around sacrificing the things we've grown accustomed to from a lifestyle point of view. And so that really informed the aha for me with Rivian, which was to make the vehicles themselves really exciting. So we built a truck and an SUV as a flagship product that it's almost silly levels of performance. It out-accelerates supercars, in terms of its horsepower and torque. It handles really well. It can go off-road better than anything in the road. And that was the idea. It's like, regardless of whether you're buying it for reasons of sustainability or not, it's just a great product. But saying that, it still has a long supply chain. We have lithium, it has cobalt, it has nickel, it has steel, aluminum, plastic, all these materials that go into it. And but it is a step towards the future state. And the way I think about this is, if you look at the automotive world, there's 1.5 billion cars on the planet today, and those are all combustion-powered vehicles. In my lifetime, the planet has to replace all of those vehicles with electric, and that's not going to happen. I wish that could happen like tomorrow, but it's going to take decades to do that. And we're going to need many companies building lots of interesting products that get customers excited about making that transition. But in parallel to that, we have to turn off thousands of fossil fuel powered power plants. So thousands of coal power plants in the United States need to be shut off. Thousands of natural gas power plants in the United States need to be shut off. We need to decommission thousands of oil rigs across the world's oceans. And that also isn't going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take decades to occur. And so when we look at the current state and say, well, I can't buy an electric because there's a bad supply chain, or I'm not going to buy photovoltaic cells because they need to be made and there's an energy associated with that. We're going to get better at building batteries. We're going to get better at building photovoltaics. The grid is today in the United States 60% fossil fuel, 40% carbon free. So you could look at it and say, well, I plug the car into the wall. There's still, fossil fuels on that grid. But over the next several decades, the grid is going to get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner as we take more and more coal-powered plants offline. We replace more natural gas power plants. The supply chains are going to get better and better and better, and we have to start this transition. And one way to look at this, which I always think is particularly illuminating, is we look at this as a choice. Like I'm talking about this as if we as society, as consumers that can vote with our wallets, have the opportunity to make this decision. And that's true, it is a choice. But in about 100 years, it won't be a choice. Our whole society is running on a very finite supply of energy. And we could debate whether we have 100 years left of fossil fuels or 200 years left of fossil fuels. But within a handful of generations, we have to move to a different source of energy. And the source of energy is going to largely be the sun. And you could argue it's entirely the sun. Wind is the sun. It's just a different form of the sun. Of course, photovoltaics are directly the sun. But my kids must, strictly by definition, we have a finite supply of fossil fuels, must exist in a world that's running on renewable energy. And so it's on us to accelerate that, to do that before we run out and before we recarbonize the atmosphere to a degree that weather patterns make big portions of the planet unlivable. Sea levels rise to a point that places like this theater won't be here anymore. So I think this is an amazing opportunity, and it's on us. The 5 or 6 generations from now are going to look back at us and be like, either good job, or they're going to say, damn it, why did they not make the decisions that they should have made at that time and damage the planet in an irreversible way? So all that said, it was a long, long way of me saying we don't have a perfect silver bullet. We have, as a society, the 8 billion people on our planet have needs. We need to eat food. We need to be, we have goals, desires. We want to be in homes and travel places and see things and explore, and that takes energy that produces carbon. But we need, as innovators, as business builders, as policymakers, as trendsetters, we need to create the pathways to do that in carbon neutral ways with closed loop supply chains that minimize the amount of materials we're extracting from the earth and the things we're pumping back into the earth. And I'm really confident that's going to happen over the next, call it, few decades.
Well, you keyed on a few things there that I think we're all acutely aware of, especially when we talk about the greening of the grid. I drive an EV, so I get this question a lot. And to me, at a minimum, EVs create cleaner air. If you could snap your fingers and every car in Los Angeles was an EV, it would probably be a lot nicer place to breathe.
We had an experiment, which was the start of COVID. So for those that live down here.
Was that intentional?
No, in the beginning of COVID, it was the first time you could look across LA and see. It was remarkable.
And it didn't take that long, did it? A couple of weeks.
It was this amazing, I described it as this little, small little sample of what it will look like 20 to 30 years from now when we no longer have gas cars on the road. And that's an exciting world. There's not a major city on the planet today that doesn't have air quality issues and for which the air quality is meaningfully worse than it was 150 years ago. I mean, just think about that. There's not a major city on the planet that doesn't have worse air quality than 150 years ago. So we are going to be part of reversing that over the next few decades.
Yeah, and the implications of that on human health and environmental health are more obvious than they ever have been before. Yeah. And we at a New Earth Project talk a lot about health as the through line. As human beings and as organizations, health needs to be the thing that we are considering when we're making decisions. And I like to say that healthy life has to have a seat at the negotiating table. And I think your organization represents that in a really powerful way. I'm curious, the greening of the grid. I mean, as we move to more EVs, I'm assuming you guys are pretty close to technologies, more renewable energy technologies. Where do you see that going? You mentioned the sun, but solar technology today probably isn't going to get us there. Are there things that you are aware of that are on the threshold of breakthroughs? Because again, that whole greening of the grid thing is I think the greatest concern, that as we have more dependence on electric vehicles, it currently could require more coal.
Yeah. Well, electric vehicles are actually one of the most important parts of the solution for the grid. I'm glad this is coming up. It's when you think about putting a lot of renewables into the grid, the challenge with a renewable is that you can create energy when you have the sun or when you have wind, but you need to use electricity not always when it may be dark out, it may not be windy, so you need to have big shock absorbers in the system. And the primary mechanism we're going to use for these shock absorbers, or these ways to decouple energy usage from energy supply, is going to be batteries. And there's going to be grid-scale batteries. We're already seeing this. But what we really need to think about is massive increase in the energy storage in the grid, and using our electric vehicles as part of that energy storage that allows the grid to operate in ways that are really both robust, but also acts as a decoupler between usage and supply. And so to get there, just to say where we are today, if you have an electric car, I have an electric car, we go home, we plug in at the end of the day. Let's say 6 o'clock we get home. It starts charging immediately. So there's no coordination today, unfortunately, amongst all the electric cars to even control or influence the demand side, the demand for electricity. So before we even think about the opportunities that exist to control the supply side, where the batteries actually play a role in putting power back into the grid, the first opportunity is to start to link the vehicles together to be demand aggregators. And you can then decide when you're pulling energy down from the grid. And this is something I'm spending a lot of time on with utilities, and we essentially need to create almost like a NASDAQ for energy. So today, the really crude way to communicate when you should or shouldn't charge is peak pricing. We see that here in California. But that's a really crude signal. We need a much more robust protocol, so when you plug in your vehicle, you as a user can say, I don't need the car until 7 a.m. tomorrow. Charge it at the most carbon efficient moment. You figure it out. And then the vehicle, or actually the company, the vehicle company, coordinates with the utilities to time that. So that's going to happen. I think that's a couple of years away.
So that's in process.
We're doing that today. So we build large commercial vans. We already do that with our commercial van fleet because we have a lot more control, because it's our big customer is Amazon. But we're going to see this across consumer vehicles for sure. We're going to launch some things pretty soon that have this energy optimization. The next step though is to have the vehicle not only control its demand side, but actually be an active participant in creating supply, so to put energy back into the grid. And this is going to solve the energy storage challenge. There's way more energy storage in our batteries in aggregate than we need to run the grid. And so it's an opportunity for you to make your asset sweat, to say, I want my vehicle to make a little bit of money by doing some of this energy storage, energy arbitrage. And of course, you're participating in making the grid greener.
So it sounds like part of what you're saying is that our current energy grid storage is relatively archaic in the way that it functions, and we have to innovate and evolve. I wouldn't call it relatively archaic. I would say insanely archaic. So our grid was, when you think of the grid, we talk about it. When you say grid, it conjures up the idea that this is some sophisticated supply-demand matching, and there's tons of AI running to make sure we're optimizing which power plants are on and which, how do we minimize carbon. The grid is a system of wires that connects a set of analog plants that run on fossil fuels that are turned off, on and off, with something that's slightly more sophisticated than a big giant lever. It's very crude. And so the biggest opportunity we have to clean up the grid is actually, even with the existing infrastructure, is to just run it in an intelligent way. And
with the advent of really accessible AI, this is going to start to change that pretty significantly, where you can understand and process and make decisioning and drive decisioning that's much more optimal for how you use the infrastructure that's there. And that's like step one. Then step two is we've got to shut off a bunch of assets, and that's where there's going to be tensions around that. People that have invested hundreds of billions of dollars into coal power plants don't want to see those coal power plants shut off early. I really do. So there's some inherent tensions there, and that's going to play out over the next few decades.
Yeah, you mentioned artificial intelligence, and like that was the question that was coming out of my mouth was, this seems like a really good place for AI, where you're computing vast amounts of data for efficiency. And it's interesting because it's the same way we work with packaging. I mean, like one of our primary objectives with sustainable packaging is first and foremost efficiency. Yeah. How do we use the least amount possible to get the job done? Exactly. And then we start focusing on the materials themselves, but efficiency is always the first step, because it also saves money.
Yeah.
Well, I see that clock ticking over there.
To that point, though, it is interesting. So we talked about how you and I both are excited around the fact that we're alive at this major transition. And the way we live, the way our society functions, was built essentially by our parents, our grandparents, grandparents, which is, again, that's also wild. Like the planet largely operated the same way for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. We had a few inventions like modern plumbing, but there wasn't like a significant explosion in technology. But people that are relatively close in proximity to us in terms of generational layers built this world, and it was built with fossil fuel. And now our generations, and maybe a generation or two to come, are going to rebuild it around renewable energy. And by coincidence, we're also seeing the birth of AI and the way it is integrated into our world, and that's going to reshape the fabric of society in ways that are unimaginable. We've seen it. We've got like a little teeny sample of it with things like ChatGPT and the way we now look at large language models, but we haven't yet seen it roll out into the physical world. And we're going to simultaneously see our whole world get rebuilt around renewable energy and a carbon-free economy as we build out a world that's integrated deeply with artificial intelligence. And how lucky are we that this moment in time, both these, arguably the two of the biggest transitions that are going to happen, at least for, I'd say, a couple of thousand years, are happening now at the same time, and we all happen to be alive during those transitions. So I think it's incumbent upon us to really take an active role in driving that.
Right on. Well, I only have about 27 more questions for you, but we're at the end of our time. I'm going to ask one more, though, even though that thing says triple zeros.
That's okay. We can do whatever we want here.
You guys good with this? No. We are here at a film festival that is doing impact storytelling, and you and I spoke, right before we came on stage about. I think we're both in agreement that we have got to connect businesses to conservation more directly. I learned recently that in North America, less than 1% of philanthropic dollars are going to conservation, which to me is staggeringly scary. And what I love about this festival and this type of impact filmmaking is not just storytelling, but storytelling and integrating those stories with brands, where your conservation efforts can be viewed not through a philanthropic lens, but through a brand lens. We talk about in packaging a lot today that packaging today is a brand attribute. Your customers are judging you ethically on your packaging, and that's a relatively new perspective and awakening. But I'm just curious, with my final question here, how you think about conservation as a brand and storytelling. Both of our organizations are members of the Conservation Alliance, which is primarily outdoor brands. We're two of the non-endemics, which I think is a really healthy thing, bringing more non-endemics into the conservation conversation. And I believe storytelling connected to brand is the way to get that 1% to 5%, 10%, maybe 25% one day.
Yeah. I think storytelling's so important for driving change. It's the reason why we bought this theater. It's not a normal course of action for a car company to buy a movie theater.
I thought the same thing.
You can imagine there's always fun board level discussions. And I'm like, so we're going to do this. And I'm like, why? But everything that we do in terms of the way we presented our products, the way that we talk about what we do as a company, the content that we create, is attempting to help build story, to tell story, to engage. And I really think storytelling is one of the most important aspects of what lies ahead for us to make these big changes as a society. And it's not always easy, but as you said at the start, engaging emotionally with folks across a variety of different backgrounds and political points of view is really going to be important for us as we drive forward here. And I think perhaps certainly more than I've seen in my adult life is the political divide that exists in the country is unfortunate and unsettling. And it's one of the reasons we talk about our kids. It's the one thing that, regardless of your political point of view, frankly, regardless of what country you live in, I'll go to the other side of the planet, and we see people look at their kids with a look and a feeling and emotion in their heart and in their eyes that is a human characteristic. That's not a U.S. characteristic. That's not a Republican characteristic or a Democratic characteristic. It's human. And when we look at the change we need to drive as a planet through the lens of our kids and their kids and their kids' kids, it's such a unifier. And that's what we try to drive with our storytelling, and it's why the content that many of you are building and creating is so important for driving this. It's not going to be one film, it's not going to be one story, but it's going to be a mosaic of stories, a mosaic of content that over time help shape and shift how our society thinks about these topics.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're absolutely right about the political divide. But as human beings, there are certain things that we all want. We want healthy children. Yeah. We want clean water. Yeah. We want clean air. Yeah. We want flourishing ecosystems. Yeah. And I think as humans and as organizations, if we can focus on the unifying things, we can really move mountains. And thank you for taking the time to sit with me today. I really appreciate what you are doing as an organization. You're absolutely one of the good guys. So thanks a lot. Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, man. Great.